This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, well, it's very good to welcome David back. I don't remember how many times you've spoken here over the years, but we'd have to consult. This is the thing with history, we can't rely on memory, we'd have to look back at the records. But you've certainly spoken on several occasions, and we're always pleased to have you back, and of course on this occasion about your new book, Paris at War, which is available, as you can see. So, over to you, David.
Okay, thank you. I'm starting with, as you can see, August 39 to May 1940. And in the summer of 1939 in Paris, the feeling was increasingly that war was going to happen sooner or later, and probably sooner. And then on 23rd of August, as you're all aware, there came the bombshell of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. And Simone de Beauvoir reacted to this by saying, "What a blow! Stalin has left Hitler free to attack Europe. The chance of peace is gone forever. Stalin couldn't care less about the European proletariat." And 2 days later, the 25th of August, the two Communist Party newspapers, L'Humanité and Ce Soir, were banned. And de Beauvoir saying, "The chance of peace is gone forever." How right she was. On the 1st of September, Germany invaded Poland, and 2 days later, as Germany had refused to withdraw, France and Britain went to war with Germany. And the two fears in Paris in that immediate period was fear that the Germans would gas Paris from the air, and the carrying of gas masks became obligatory. You can see some rather well-dressed ladies here carrying them, and both were comments that the prostitutes at the other end of the social scale were also carrying them when they were out in the streets looking for customers. The other fear, obviously, was bombing. The fear that Germany would bomb Paris. And this coincided with a strong anti-Soviet, anti-communist feeling, and both at the public level and the government level. At the public level, there was an example in the suburb of Bagnolet of a local Communist Party councillor being refused entry into the air raid shelter by the locals, who were making him stay outside and were saying, you know, "It serves you right if your friend's bombs land on your head." The government was also going pretty easy on pro-German organisations and sympathisers, and the Communist Party became the main target of repression. But the gassing didn't happen, the fighting didn't happen, people stopped carrying gas masks, people stopped scuttling off to shelters, and really people began to wonder what it was all about. The repression against the Communist Party increased after the Soviet invasion of Poland. The Communist Party was banned, as were the parliamentary group, the Communist Parliamentary Group, trade union organisations and branches linked to the PCF, and militants as well were just being rounded up wholesale by the French police and put in camps and prisons. And during this period, September, October, the Communist Party line is not terribly clear, but then from October it becomes very clear, and they are arguing that the war is an imperialist war that the French working class should have nothing to do with. Just to give you some idea, by March 1940, 2,700 councillors had been sacked from their positions, and over about 3,500 militants, Communist Party militants, had been arrested. Many were in camps, and by the end of 1941 the number had risen to 6,000. So this is the phony war, grinds on till with people saying, well, why are we at war? We went to war to defend Poland, we didn't do anything, now Poland surrendered, why are we still at war? And suddenly the answer came, May the 10th, when Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, which was sort of anticipated, they would sooner or later, but then the real shock was May the 13th, when Germany invaded France. And on the 16th, the Manchester Guardian representative journalist in Paris said, "No doubt about it, people are clearing out of Paris. There's panic in the air." And this is where you start getting the exodus beginning, the mass exodus from Paris, which is accelerated beginning of June when the Germans bombed the Renault factories in southwest of Paris, and on June the 10th when the French government, which had said over and over again that it would never leave Paris, promptly left Paris. And therefore this is a sign of people, familiar sign of people on the road, bicycles, trucks, walking, whatever way they could, getting out. The Germans arrived in Paris on the 14th of June, and a German soldier reported in his diary that it was like walking into a ghost town because so many of the Parisians had fled, so many of the buildings and shops and houses were boarded up. About 1 million Parisians had fled the city, and the city itself, and about 3 million from Greater Paris. To give you some idea, I'm saying 1 million left. The population of Paris in the last census of 1936 was about 2.5 million. So it's about half the population is gone. 17th, Pétain makes his broadcast. Pétain, by now head of the French government, makes his broadcast telling people with a heavy heart that it's time to stop fighting. And the following day, de Gaulle makes his now famous broadcast from London, urging people to join him to carry on the fight. I say now well known, hardly anybody heard de Gaulle's broadcast, and the BBC didn't even bother to keep a record of his speech. He had to record it a few days later. The Communist Party at this time, on the 18th, is urging in its underground paper, remember the paper's been made illegal, in its underground paper is urging fraternisation between French workers and German soldiers. And the following day, the 19th, this is something that the party denied for years and years and years. They tried to get the Germans to allow them to publish L'Humanité legally. They made contact with the German propaganda bureau, but sort of turned slightly farcical at this point. The French police are so intent on rounding up communists that they rounded up the people who'd been in discussions with the Germans. And this infuriated Otto Abetz, who was the German ambassador to Paris. They were released, and they met Abetz later in June, and it looked as if it was going to happen, and then the whole project collapsed. The Third International got cold feet about it, and so did the French Communist Party itself, as did the Germans, and so the thing never got off the ground, but it looked very much as if it might. Just to go back a little bit, we then had the armistice on the 22nd of June, which resulted in the dismemberment of France. Paris was in the occupied zone and becomes de facto the German capital of France. The French government sets up in Vichy in the unoccupied zone, and what's sometimes forgotten or not known is that the Parisians were subject to both Vichy laws and German directives. And the German Wehrmacht, the German army, was officially in charge of the occupation. Hitler made a flying visit to Paris in June, a one-day visit, and here he is in front of the Eiffel Tower, not Charlie Chaplin at Blackpool. So with the Germans now in charge of Paris, the German army in particular, you get the changing face of Paris. The French national anthem, the Marseillaise, is banned. The tricolore, the French national flag, is banned, replaced by the swastika. Paris is moved on to German time. Buildings are requisitioned, private homes, hotels, schools, and hospitals. And in the centre of Paris, you see not only the flags on the tops of buildings, but big banners. Here's the Rue de Rivoli, I hope. The big banners hanging there. The city is bristling with signposts. to help the Germans find their way around Paris and beyond. Germans are very much in evidence in the... This is a rather posed photograph. It was actually a postcard that Germans used to send home to say, here we are in Paris. They concentrated round the tourist sites in the centre of the city and very rarely went out into the outskirts or to the edge of the city, which they considered to be dangerous, unless, of course, they had a very good reason for doing so. And the scene on the roads changed. Cars virtually disappeared and were replaced by horse-drawn traffic, bicycles, and you can see here bicycle taxis, where bicycles are attached to little carts and used to ferry people around, replacing the old petrol-driven cars. So what was the German policy towards the Parisians? Really what they wanted to keep calm, keep everything calm, have no trouble. After all, Hitler is preparing at this point to invade Britain. And they were very keen to get cinemas and theatres open as soon as possible. They wanted to provide distractions for the Parisians to take their minds off, as they saw it, their present circumstances. And they also provided free open-air concerts with German military bands. And looking in the newspapers and the radio broadcasts, what they're emphasising all the time is continuity. They're saying nothing has really changed. It's pretty much as it was before. You can hear Tino Rossi on the radio, you can hear Maurice Chevalier on the radio. They were putting plays on the radio that had been on the radio before the occupation. And this was also part of that, the thrust of that line in propaganda was to encourage people to return. They didn't want the Parisians wandering around in France, they wanted them to return. Another theme of the propaganda was to play on the feeling of many Parisians that they had been abandoned. They'd been abandoned by the British at Dunkirk, they'd been abandoned by their own government. And this was a poster that appeared across Paris at this time. Abandoned people, abandoned populations, trust the German soldier. So you can't trust the government, you can't trust the British, but you can trust the German soldier. And 3 little children and a good-looking German soldier looking very reassuring. And alongside this came the propaganda of, we are your friends, but these are your true enemies, the Jews, the politicians of the Third Republic, and the British. So there was this charm offensive going on, but there was also, there was also from the very beginning a darker side. The pillaging had started from the word go. It was carried out, they were targeting particularly Jewish artifacts and Masonic artifacts, and also treasures in museums that the Germans considered were their property. And I said that the Wehrmacht, the army, was officially in charge of the occupation. The army was opposed to this pillaging, but was unable to stop it. And within the city, from the word go, you had key Nazis, top Nazis, who had their own men in the city, trying to undermine the army's power, get influence, get power away from the army. So Goebbels, Goering, von Ribbentrop, and Himmler all had men there trying to undermine the army's position. And therefore, Paris becomes somewhere where the power struggles in Berlin are played out. And I say, obviously, more about that in the book. So that's the attitude of the Germans. What about the Parisians? A lot of the Parisians who stayed were people who were working class or poor working class, lower social strata. Why? Because they had nowhere to go and they had no way of getting there. So a lot of they were made up the larger proportion of the population who stayed. There was a chap who cycled around the rich areas of the 16th after the Germans had come and observed that it was all boarded up, which was not the case in the more popular areas. So the concerns of most Parisians was to put their life back together again after the shock of the defeat. In other words, to make sure they get hold of food, clothing, household goods. huge concern about prisoners of war. Nobody at this stage, we're talking at this stage, July, August, people very often didn't know what had happened to the men who'd been captured, or maybe they'd been killed. And some people had to wait till January the following year to find out what had happened. And there were about 2.5 million prisoners of war, an awful lot. And there was also the issue of you couldn't communicate with the unoccupied zone. So it was total, people's lives were turned upside down and inside out. Parisians, as I mentioned, were drifting back, and this was creating tension between the people who had remained in Paris and the people who had left. And the general atmosphere really is one of resignation, wait and see, acceptance, growing acceptance of the new status quo. One of the diarists I used said, "It's a disgrace to get used to seeing the swastika flying over the Chamber of Deputies, Parliament building. But you do get used to it. The nightmare becomes completely normal." But from the beginning there was quite a lot of passive resistance. One of the things which was very widespread, that many of the diarists I consulted commented on, as did the prefect of the French police, the Parisians refusing to look at the Germans when they passed them in the street. And the Germans end up calling Paris die Stadt ohne Blick, the city that doesn't look at you. There was a man called Jean Texier, a trade unionist, who published a little pamphlet of 33 tips of what to do when you're under occupation, how to deal with the Germans. So if a German approaches you to ask some information, you either pretend you don't understand German, or if you do understand and he wants to go this way, the place is over there, you tell him to go over here. And one of the tips was very important. He said, "And whatever you do, hang on to your anger, because this will come in later on." There was a protest in the cinema, particularly during the newsreels, which got so bad that they had to project the newsreel with the lights on. And there must have been quite a lot of this passive resistance, because Radio Paris, the only Paris station now under German control, complained about the Parisians not being polite to the Germans and treating them badly and being rude to them and all that sort of thing. So we had, again, other things, women refusing to take seats in the metro offered to them by the Germans, letting doors in the metro corridors swing back in Germans' faces, all that sort of thing. That was making enough of a mark for the Radio Paris to comment on it. Of course, I'm going to bring the Third Reich to its knees, but there was also a big demonstration that's sometimes forgotten about on the Armistice Day of November the 11th, when several thousand school children and students massed at the Arc de Triomphe to protest at the German presence. Obviously, Armistice Day, a bit of a sore point for the occupying forces. The people in London reported that 10 people had been killed. This was not the case, but a lot of these students were very badly treated. Alongside this, you did have the beginnings of very small resistance groups, and it's almost an exaggeration to call them groups. Sometimes it was just one person. And resistance really consisted of producing, distributing anti-Nazi leaflets, stickers, and news sheets. One of the most famous groups was one called the Museum of Mankind, Musée de l'Homme. And here are the two famous members of that group. Boris Wilde on the left, who was in effect the leader, and Agnès Humbert, another member, on the right. The group was betrayed, Wilde and 6 others were executed at the beginning of 1942. Humbert was deported into slave labour in Germany, but did return. One of the main problems that most people faced in Paris was that one of shortages and shopping. I mean, today, if we think about ourselves when we go shopping, as long as we can afford something, we assume that when we go to the shop, it will be there, and if it isn't there, if it isn't in Tesco's, it'll be in the Co-op or something, but we will come home with what we want. This was absolutely not the case in Paris. Queues were just part of daily experience, and I'll just read a little bit from the book. This is an account of one woman who went shopping one morning, shopping trips. 7:30, go to the baker's, buy some bread. They'll have some biscotte to buy some bread. They'll have some biscotte, toasted bread, at 11 o'clock. 9 o'clock, today is a day you can buy meat. You couldn't buy meat every day. There were certain days when you could buy it. Today is a day you can buy meat. The butcher tells us that it will not be delivered until Saturday. 9:30, at the cheese sellers. The cheese will not be here until 5 o'clock. 10 o'clock, at the tripe shop. My ticket is number 32. I won't be served until 4 o'clock. 10:30, at the greengrocers. There will be no vegetables. There will be vegetables at 5 o'clock. 11 o'clock, back to the baker's, no biscuit left. And I just comment here, her morning consisted in total of 6 trips, 3.5 hours of waiting, and almost nothing to show for it. And she had another, inverted commas, shopping trip planned for the afternoon. And that is something that was absolutely very widespread, very, very common. Rationing was introduced in 1940, but that didn't solve the problems. If you could have ration tickets and you still couldn't get hold of the goods that you wanted, and people had to resort to other means of finding ways of getting food. One was to go into the country and buy from the peasant farmers. You could get out of Paris into the occupied zone quite easily. You couldn't get into the unoccupied zone. And one of my diarists, a retired school teacher, went and came staggering back with potatoes, honey, bees, cheeses, as she said, a little bit of security for the days ahead. Another option was to have people in the countryside send you food. The 15-year-old schoolgirl, whose diary I used a lot, her family received 50 kilos of potatoes at a time when she said there wasn't a single potato to be had in Paris. Barter was another thing. Somebody else, another diarist, gave Latin lessons to the daughter of someone who ran a dairy and was paid in milk. Or you could grow your own. Again, the retired schoolmistress turned her back bedroom into an allotment, and she grew parsnips and carrots in a strip of damp sand. She had potatoes germinating and leeks spread out in front of the fireplace, as she put it, like a present for Father Christmas. And she and other people also talk about people keeping rabbits and chickens in their flats. And the final option, which most people tried to avoid, was the black market. And I say quite a lot in the book about the black market and the different scale of operations that were covered by the term black market. 1941, London launched a campaign in March, the V campaign. And this is about the time when London starts using da-da-da-da for its broadcast, the Beethoven, opening bars of Beethoven, which spell out Morse code for V, and asked people in Paris and across France to put chalk Vs, paint Vs, tear up metro tickets into Vs, put as many Vs for victory wherever they can. And the retired schoolmistress talked about Paris being covered with being enveloped in an orgy of Vs. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then on the 22nd of June, as you all know, it was when the Wehrmacht invaded Russia. What was the response in Paris? It was welcomed more or less universally, but for very different reasons. The anti-Nazis hoped that the Red Army would crush the Wehrmacht. The pro-Nazis hoped that the Wehrmacht would destroy Bolshevism. And some were not content with just hoping that it would. They wanted to get in there and contribute. And there was the creation of a league of French volunteers against Bolshevism the men went off to fight in German uniform on the Eastern Front alongside the Germans. And they were known, or their supporters referred to them as the Crusaders against Anglo-Jewish Bolshevik disorder. And here's a poster, a recruitment poster. You can see, I hope, there on the right-hand side, the badge with LVF, the big V there, the Crusader. Behind the Crusader, the shadow of a German soldier, and in the background, Russian-style buildings burning away. The LVF was backed by all the collaborationist organisations in Paris, especially Doriot's PPF. It had its barracks in Versailles, it had its headquarters in Paris, and Otto Abetz, the ambassador, gave the LVF 80 premises that had been previously owned by Jews to use for recruitment offices, as recruitment offices. With the invasion of Russia, the Germans were initially cock-a-hoot because they were making such progress so fast. Stalin had been warned of the invasion for many months, taken no notice, and then suddenly, and therefore they were unprepared. And what the Germans in Paris did, they responded to the de Gaulle V campaign with a V campaign of their own. And here we have the Parliament building. You can see the huge V on the top, and Deutschland siegt an allen Fronten. Germany is winning on all fronts. And the same slogan appears here on the Eiffel Tower. So how did the Communist Party respond? The Communist Party, now freed from the shackles of the Non-Aggression Pact, had two strands to its policy, which are, I'm not sure if they're complementary or contradictory. One was to start talking about national liberation, and the other was to throw itself into armed resistance, or more precisely, to throw its young militants into action against the Germans. It didn't start with armed action, but it started with much more public demonstrations. And so from July we had what we would call flash mobs in streets and markets. Youngsters would occupy the street for as long as they could, shouting slogans, throwing around leaflets, and then dispersing before the police, either the French police, the German police, or the German army arrived. These were the youth battalions, les bataillons de la jeunesse. And one woman recalled, "We were moving to a higher level. We were demonstrating in the street in broad daylight." This was going on for a while, and then the discussions began to take place. Should they go further? Should they actually start assassinating German soldiers? And this obviously raised a lot of moral and political questions. And I go into that in the book. They're reconstructed from the memories of people who were there at the time. And that was brought to a head. That dilemma was resolved actually by the Germans. Firstly, these I'm using dates here because they are important. A poster dated the 19th of August 1941 announced the execution of two communist youngsters who had taken part in a street demonstration of the type I described on the 13th of August. They had been executed. And one was, the Germans went out of their way to insist that he was Jewish. The following day, 20th of August, the Germans mobilized the French police for a roundup of some 4,000 Jewish men from the 11th arrondissement. 11th arrondissement is in the east of the city. It's a very poor area, and it was a hotbed of communist, by communist I mean French Communist Party, communist activity, and there were also a very high concentration of Jews. So it was, for them, hitting the two enemies, Jews and communists, with a single roundup. And these are the first Jews who were sent to Drancy, the big camp to the northeast of Paris, which became notorious as a place from which people were sent to the death camps. 21st of August, the communists hit back, and somebody called Pierre Georges, accompanied by another militant, went to a metro station just north of the Gare du Nord, about this Rochechouart, early in the morning, about 8 o'clock in the morning, and were waiting, looking, and then somebody wearing a fairly swanky uniform came walking along the platform, and as he stepped into the first-class carriage, because the Germans travelled first class, Pierre Georges went up behind him and shot him in the back, and he collapsed dead into the carriage. And this is a metro station called Colonel Fabien, or Colonel Fabian, if you want to put it in English. That was the resistance name of Pierre Georges, and that metro station is still there. So he is remembered there. And the next So this is the beginning of the armed resistance, and other attempts, successful and unsuccessful, followed. This, I think, I find this a very interesting picture. I hope you do too. It's a German, probably taken by the German secret police, the army police, the secret police of the army, and it's a reconstruction of an assassination. You could see the officer on the pavement looking at what's going on. Now here's the resistant, or the person playing the resistor, on the bicycle, coming up behind the German guy who's with a woman in the street. The German response to the assassinations was to decree that anybody who was held in prison for any reason whatsoever would now be considered a hostage. And for every assassination attempt, and every successful or otherwise, hostages would be taken out and shot. And not to be outdone, Vichy established new courts which allowed the Vichy regime to take people who had been been in prison for fairly minor offences, like giving out leaflets, and retry them and sentence them to death. So this is Vichy's idea was that people who'd been tried by these special courts should be guillotined in a public square, and even the Germans thought that was a bit much. And that did not happen, but the courts did operate, and people were executed as a result. The Communist Party policy of assassinating Germans was extremely unpopular, which alienated the youngsters who were carrying this out, made them feel even more marginalised, and the Communist Party refused to take responsibility for the actions. Now that changes at the end of 1941. There's a change in the perception, both in the police reports that I consulted and in the diaries. Public opinion, as far as we can establish it, starts to turn against the Germans, not so much against the people carrying out the assassinations. One police report wrote of disapproval of the German actions, hostility towards them, and that the police expected there to be a rise in what they called terrorism, what we might call armed resistance. Anti-Bolshevik propaganda continues into 1942, and in March an exhibition opened entitled Bolshevism Against Europe, and this is the front cover of the programme. And the next photograph is, I think, an amateur photograph. I don't think it's anything official, and it shows in the right-hand corner, the poster for that exhibition, Bolshevism Against Europe, but at the same time, or alongside it, there's a tree, and I don't know what the quality is like on the screen, but there is a big V for victory carved in the screen, and above it, the Gaullist cross with the two crossbars. 1942 was also a period when repression against Jews increased. There had been victimisation and repression from the autumn, both by Vichy and by the Germans. And now we get the first convoy from Drancy to the death camps, with the people that I mentioned who've been rounded up, and along with others are sent off in March 1942, and in June 1942 the ruling is passed, the directive is passed, that all Jews over the age of 6 years old have to wear the yellow star when they go out. And here we can see two Jewish women walking in the street wearing the yellow star. Now there was a response from, I think, about 50 Parisians who started wearing yellow stars in solidarity with the Jews, non-Jews wearing yellow stars in solidarity. And this is a photograph I took of two of them, and I'll just say very briefly what they are. There's the top one that says Auvergnat, and this one at the bottom says Swing 42. Auvergnat, that is someone who comes from the Auvergne, an area of central France. And I managed to track down the report by the arresting officer who arrested the man wearing this. He was a 38-year-old architect from the Auvergne who was wearing it in solidarity with the Jews. He made the start, put it on, went out. Somebody accosted him in the street and said, "You can't do that." And he said, "Well," anyway, a fight ensued, or not clear, it was an argument, a dispute ensued, and the Auvergnat was arrested. I'll say what happened to the people in a minute. The other one, swing. Swing refers to swing as a form of jazz, which the Nazis hated, absolutely loathed. They banned it in Germany. Degenerate music, and as they would say, it was written by Jews and played by black people or Negroes. But it wasn't banned in France. It was actually very popular in France. But it was associated with rebellion. And it was associated, and non-conformity, it was associated with a youth movement that was operating mainly in Paris and in certain parts of Paris, 41 to 42, called the Zazou, who were youngsters who dressed in a particular way. They weren't resistors, but they were rebels and non-conformists. And they identified very strongly with swing. So this badge saying Swing 42 is a way of identifying with a sort of an opposition. It's really an extension of, I think, of passive resistance. The people who were arrested wearing these yellow stars were sent to Drancy, but were released in August. There was a woman who'd attached a yellow star to the dog of her tail. There was a Catholic girl who wore one, schoolgirl, and she was sent. They were all packed off there, but then they were released in August. July, still 1942, the biggest roundup of Jews takes place. 13,500 Jews arrested by the French police, mainly women and children. Up to now it's been men who've been arrested, 45% women, 31% children. The men and the childless couples were sent to Drancy. The couples and mothers with children were sent first of all to the Vélodrome d'Hiver, the Veldiv, a big cycle stadium in Paris, and then they were sent to camps south of Paris, but then most of them were subsequently brought to Drancy and deported. And here is a woman called Edith Thomas who saw one of the trains going with the Jews on board. "I saw a goods train. In the cattle trucks there were some children. Their hands were poking through the barred windows. For the first time in my life I felt a cold shiver of horror run down my spine." In June 1942, so this is a year on from the German invasion of Russia, things are absolutely not going Germany's way. And what's happening in Germany is that workers are being taken from the factories and being conscripted into the army and being packed off to the Eastern Front to replace all those who have been killed. And then they've got an acute labour shortage in Germany. And in June 42, Pierre Laval, you might call him the Prime Minister of the Vichy government, came up with a scheme whereby workers who volunteered to go to Germany would secure the release of prisoners of war at a rate of 3 to 1. So 3 French workers go to Germany, 1 prisoner of war is released. And here is a poster, here is a poster from the Relève, and it says at the top, "You have the key to the camps." And then underneath it says, "French workers, you will liberate or free the prisoners by going to work in Germany." And this was in launching this relève, which means relief, really, that Laval made the famous statement that I want Germany to win, for without that victory, Bolshevism will establish itself everywhere. February 1943. By February 1943, the Relève is not getting enough people. It did recruit about 85,000 workers from the Paris area, Greater Paris area alone. So a lot of people, about 240,000 from France. The Germans kept asking for more and for more and for more. It was clearly it wasn't going to be enough. So in February, 2 things happened. Stalin, the surrender, the German surrender at Stalingrad, and a launching of a obligatory conscription program. This now, French workers have to go to work in Germany. This is called the STO, and this is a poster advertising it. and the top line says, they're giving their blood, they being the German soldiers are giving their blood, and down the bottom, give your labour power and save Europe from Bolshevism. Now there was huge reaction to this across the country, in Paris and across the country. In the Sorbonne there were posters saying, resist, don't go. The Free French in London, in their broadcast, said, don't go to, ne va pas en Allemagne, don't go to Germany. They used this slogan over 1,500 times, and there was huge opposition from across the classes and across the country. One of the diarists, my diarists, saw a contingent of workers who'd been rounded up to be sent to Germany in an open lorry in the Latin Quarter, and they were chanting Laval to the shithouse. And he added that all the shopkeepers were clapping. So what were the options here? If you didn't want to go, well, you could refuse to register. You could register and try and find a doctor who would say that you weren't fit for work. You could, if that didn't work, you could miss the train. My pen friend's father in Lyon, not in Paris, got that far, couldn't find a doctor, and he missed the train, joined the resistance and went into a factory and carried out sabotage. Some sections of the population were excused, but the numbers of the groups that were excused got smaller and smaller as time went on. And the other thing to do was to go underground, and that usually meant leaving Paris, because to go underground in Paris without papers, it meant somebody had to provide food for you, and they weren't getting much food anyway. So what a lot of people did was they got out of Paris, and a number, but not as many as some people make out, joined the maquis, the rural resistance. You also get in 1943 the consolidation of the resistance itself. And in Paris, in the Saint-Germain area of Paris, under the very noses of the Germans, a meeting took place in May, and there's a plaque on the wall. This is a photograph I took of the flat where it took place. The leaders of all the main resistance groups came together to form the CNR, Conseil National de Résistance, an umbrella organisation which recognised de Gaulle as its head. So de Gaulle is now the head of the resistance forming. Now that was more on paper than in reality, and the resistors and de Gaulle both had their own reasons for wanting that. But that is nevertheless a consolidation, and it was Jean Moulin, de Gaulle's delegate to France, who brought that about. Moulin was subsequently tortured to death by Klaus Barbie. What else? The other show, we've got resistance consolidating, and we've also got, and this is something that is missing from a lot of accounts of Paris during the war, is the Allied bombing of Paris. Bombing is very much part of our narrative of what happened here, particularly thinking of the Blitz. It's not something you think about particularly in context of Paris, particularly with the Allied bombing. It started in March 1942. The Allies bombed Renault, and it escalated from then through 1943 and 44. The target for factories, there were two types of target. Factories working for the German war effort around Paris, the red belt around Paris, and also targeting rail networks so that the German transport networks would be disrupted. And this was going on 1943-44. Just to give you two examples, in 1943, the schoolgirl I was telling you about, her sister had a lucky escape. She was going out with some friends on an outing. She was going down into the metro. She had a picnic basket with her. It opened, all the bits fell out. She picked them all up, put them back in again. They missed the metro train just as well, because 2 stops down the line, got hit by an Allied bomb, and 80 people were killed. And in the same raid, the Longchamp racecourse in the Bois de Boulogne was hit. And people were killed, the bodies were laid out on the racetrack, and they were removed. And then I found this amazing, and the races started. Anyway, quite surprised about that. Let's see, so we've got to... Sorry, I've got a note of it. Okay. In February 1944 was the trial of the Manouchian group. And this is, you may have heard of this. This is the red poster. There's a group. I'll say a little bit about the background. In April 1942, the Communist Party had formed the FTP, which was to bring together their fighters into a single organisation called the FTP. And then in the summer of 1942, the FTP linked up to the MOI, which was the immigrant organisation. The Communist Party had immigrant organisations by ethnicity or language. And each of the MOIs, which were not fighting, gave 10% of their members to form fighting units. So you had FTP, MOI for Jews, Spaniards, etc. And between the summer and December of 42, they carried out about 60 fairly spectacular actions in Paris. But by 1943, the networks had been more or less broken, and they were what was left were put into two groups. And the Manouchian group, that's this group here, was one of them, led by a man called Misak Manouchian, who was an Armenian. And in August 43, the group members realised that the police were onto them. They were being followed, they could feel the police were moving in, and they asked the Communist Party to get them out of Paris. Give us a break, take us away, we're going to be rounded up. And the Communist Party refused. It got the political leaders out, but the people on the ground were left behind. And one of the people who was taken out later said that the Communist Party was in large part responsible for the group being arrested. October 43, the head of the FTP MOI is arrested, interrogated, talks, and in November 43, the police swoop on the Manouchian group and they go on trial in 44. 10 years later, a photo I took in the 20th arrondissement, there is a street now named after them. But Manouchian himself, in his letter, his last letter to his wife, said, I forgive all those who who did me harm or who wanted to do so, except the one who betrayed us, a man called Davidovich, and those who sold us out. I think that's a pretty clear reference to the Communist Party leadership who would not get them out. And the quote from the person who was got out, looking back on it, this is the quote from him: "The PCF leadership committed a serious political error and is without a doubt partly responsible for the arrests." The bombing continued, and this is a serious bombing raid in April 1944. You can see in the 18th arrondissement, just in front of Sacré-Cœur. It brought Pétain to Paris, his first trip to Paris, and I couldn't get the total number of deaths in number of people killed by the Allied bombing, but I did find a figure between April the 10th and the 25th, 44, 1,500 inhabitants of the Greater Paris area were killed. There's a lot of people, and I don't know what it would have been, what the total is, I don't know. And then on the June the 6th, we get D-Day, and people realise that the end is nigh. I say people, the Germans and the Parisians realise that the end is nigh. But life in Paris is getting harder because the Allied disruption of the German rail network is disrupting food supplies, and Paris is running out of food. The retired schoolmistress I mentioned said that out of 10 food shops, 9 are closed and the 10th is more or less empty. We've been told officially that Parisians have days without food ahead of them. And then she starts saying, maybe we're going to have to eat grass and eat rats. And then, because she had a very nice sense of humour, she said, perhaps the cruelest blow of all, wine. There's no wine getting through. Then in beginning of August, the news comes through that the Americans were advancing very, very fast and the Russians were on German soil. August the 15th, the police go on strike in Paris and there are Allied landings in the south of France. And the 17th, the Germans start leaving France in large numbers. They're panicking and leaving. They know they believe that the Allies are on their way, and on the same day that they're leaving, there's enough flour in Paris to keep it in bread just for a week. And the resistance within Paris, a lot of the resistance is pressing for an insurrection. And the Gaullist representatives in Paris are saying, no, wait, hang on. And then the police occupy the Préfecture de Police, and the call for an insurrection goes up, and the resistors begin seizing local town halls, government buildings, and the tricolour is again flying. But there are still 20,000 German troops in Paris. Some are digging in, defending certain positions, and others are out on the rampage. They're going around with their guns, pointing and shooting down Parisians on the street at random. The schoolgirl I mentioned was in her flat, and I think with a, if it's not a sexist and ageist thing to say, had a very typical 15-year-old response to this. She saw Germans in lorries going past with rifles and machine guns pointing in all directions, and she wrote in her diary, "This is all so exciting. I don't expect Maman will let me go to the dentist this afternoon." But then the following day she went out with her sister and they went out and took photographs. So it was quite a dangerous thing to do. Now everybody's expecting the Allies to arrive sooner or later. They're on their way. What they don't know is that the Allies have no intention of coming to Paris. The Americans have ruled it out. And General Bradley said that Paris is just an ink spot on a map, we're not interested. That decision was reversed on the 22nd of August, and that's the day when the call goes up for everybody to the barricades. And here we have people, youngsters, women, men, all ages, building barricades. Good way of involving the population in what's going on in Paris. Barricades were to isolate the Germans and protect certain areas. This is a barricade at the bottom of the Rue Saint-Jacques, and I was a bit puzzled by the photographs on there. When I saw the photograph of that, I was puzzled by the photographs on there. And then one of the diarists who lived nearby said that the people at the barricades had raided a fascist bookshop and taken pictures of Mussolini, Hitler, and Goering, and stuck them up there. So when the Germans fired at them, they'd be hitting their own heroes. A lot of fighting went on around the Préfecture de Police, and here's a picture you can see on there, the bullet holes. They're still there. If you go and walk around the Préfecture de Police, you can see the battle scars from the insurrection. This is these sort of plaques you'll see all over Paris. People who were killed during the uprising. I know what happened to this person because I met the person who was with him when he was killed. He was a concierge, and he said, "Oh, hang on, I'm going to go and get my gun." Went, goodness knows why he kept it and how he managed to keep it. He went down to his cellar, got the gun, and was standing with the gun, sort of looking around for Germans, and then suddenly dropped down dead. He'd been hit by a sniper because the Germans and the militia, the far-right French militia, were up on the rooftops picking people off at random. Here's some fighting in the Rue de Rivoli. The car's been requisitioned by the Paris Liberation Committee, and that's two French police officers there. I said about people coming under sniper fire. Here is the day after the German surrender and the day that de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées. So the Germans surrendered on the 25th, but fighting continued. This is the 26th. On the Place de la Concorde, people running for cover under sniper fire, and here again you can still see them there, the bullet holes in on the Place de la Concorde. On the 26th, here's de Gaulle, first time that many people had seen him, and he's striding down the Champs-Élysées, making sure that the people who were with him, the other resistance, the resistance heads of the resistance group are kept behind him. He made sure that he was always in front and the other people were always behind him. And you can see the Arc de Triomphe, and then you can see the turnout at the end, the bottom of the Champs-Élysées here, where he's now got in a car and he's going off to Notre Dame for Mass, and that's more or less the liberation. The city is more or less liberated, except that the Germans, just out of pure spite, carried out a bombing raid that night and killed about 150 people. Just bombed the city because they wanted to. So Paris is liberated, but of course France is not liberated until the following May. So there we are.
Okay, thanks very much.